Yeah. So I am so honored to have Professor Chris Miller here today. Chris is an associate professor of international history at the Fletcher School at the Tufts University. He's published 4 books. The latest one, Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology, is shortlisted by the Financial Times as one of the best business books of the year. The New Yorker calls it an essential, engrossing landmark study, combining technology, economic analysis, geopolitics, and good old-fashioned storytelling. Chris, this is exactly how I felt when I read your book. So today's event is organized by the volunteers of a community consisting of Chinese American entrepreneurs. So on the screen, we have April and Annie being our volunteers. So if the audience has questions, please direct them to Annie and April. And so our focus today is really on the chip industry, the business, as well as the entrepreneurs in it. So we'll touch upon the geopolitical and industrial policies that have impacted the industry so much. The hope is that we can all walk away with our own views on what the future has in store for us. So my first question, Chris, is why are chips so important to us all? And what would happen to our lives if the top chip maker, in this case, TSMC, stopped making chips tomorrow?
Well, today, semiconductors are a device that, although most of us never see, in fact, we can't live without. From the moment we wake up, your alarm clock has semiconductors inside. Turn on your coffee maker, there's chips inside of that. Sit in your car, a new car will often have 1,000 semiconductors inside of it. And even before you open your laptop or look at your smartphone, you've touched or relied upon dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of semiconductors. So the typical person in the United States or in many countries will, over the course of their daily life, rely on thousands of chips. And they're all buried deep inside of electronic devices, or increasingly, they're actually in data centers hundreds of thousands of miles away, but they structure our economy, our society, our politics in ways that most of us, and myself before I wrote this book, were hardly aware. The last couple of years have given a slight lesson or a slight case study in what society would look like if we faced a substantial deficit of chips. You've probably heard about the chip shortage in 2020, 2021. In fact, there wasn't really a supply problem with chips in either of those years. The number of chips produced globally increased by 8% between 2020 and 2021, and then at double-digit rates the subsequent year. But demand shot up even higher, and so there was a shortage of chips that resulted.
Very counterintuitive piece of knowledge, right?
Yeah. No, it's very much contrary to the narrative in the media, but it's important, I think, because it shows that we didn't even really experience a serious shortage in the last couple of years, and yet the impact on the economy, even outside the tech sector, was profound. So the auto industry is estimated to have lost $200 billion of revenue globally as a result of semiconductor shortages, because cars were almost ready to be completed, but were missing 1 or 2 chips and couldn't roll off the factory parking lot without them. And that illustrates the extent to which, although chips themselves are a $500 billion business globally every year, they provide a foundation on which a far larger share of the economy depends. And you mentioned TSMC in Taiwan, which is the world's largest chip maker, also the world's most advanced maker of processor chips. And today, TSMC produces 90% of the world's most advanced processor chips, the type of chips that go into a smartphone or a PC or data centers. They also, Taiwan in whole, which is largely TSMC, produces over 1/3 of the new computing power the world adds each year. If you add up transistors in processor chips, over 1/3 of them are produced in Taiwan each year. And so that gives you a sense of the absolutely central role that Taiwan plays in the entire world tech sector and also the world economy.
Yeah, so if they stop making chips tomorrow and I drop my iPhone in the sink, then I'm out of luck for a couple of years, right?
I think that's right. And it's your iPhone, it's many PCs, it's data center expansion, but it's also cars and dishwashers and microwaves, because it's not the case that no one else can produce semiconductors for dishwashers, but a lot of semiconductors in fairly simple devices that don't require advanced computing power nevertheless rely on TSMC for their production. And because there's so much capacity in Taiwan and there's not a lot of spare capacity elsewhere, we would face tremendous delays and disruptions across even non-tech goods if we were to lose access to production in Taiwan.
Yeah, exactly. So let me take a step back. And so, Chris, you were trained as a scholar in Russian history and economics. So what triggered your interest in writing such a book?
Well, I started with a puzzle about technology, and I wanted to understand why it was during the second half of the 20th century that some key military technologies were possible to be created by both the Soviet Union and the United States. So atomic weapons, long-range missile systems, in the 1950s and 60s, both countries had roughly comparable capabilities to produce them. But by the end of the 20th century, a huge gap had opened up between the military capabilities of the United States and those of the Soviet Union and other competitors. And that seemed like a puzzle because the Soviet Union had lots of very smart physicists and engineers, which is a clear input into new technology. It had lots of capital expenditure and a big defense budget, which is another input into new technology. And so it seemed like an interesting and confusing puzzle as to why the Soviet Union couldn't keep up, given the obvious importance, plus the presence of some really key inputs to advanced technology. And the more I dug into this question, the more I realized that key to the transformation of military power over the last 70 years is the application of computing capabilities as well as sensing and communications capabilities to military systems. So you compare, for example, a fighter jet today versus a fighter jet from 50 years ago. The design is not all that different. Designs are slightly stealthier today. The engines are really quite similar in many ways. They still have landing gear and canopies, and anyone who designed a fighter jet 50 years ago would have no difficulty recognizing a fighter jet today, but their capabilities are totally different, not because of the structure, but because of what's inside, the computing, the sensing, the communications, and the ability to interact with sensors and computing capabilities in other systems that are networked to them. And so this networking and computing capability really transformed how militaries operate, just like it transformed how the rest of the economy functions. And so I began to ask, well, why couldn't the Soviet Union do that too? And it turns out that the Soviet Union invented their first integrated circuits just 2 years after the first integrated circuits were invented in the United States. So it wasn't a problem with prototyping technology. There were a number of prominent Soviet scientists who were real experts and even Nobel Prize winners in semiconductor physics. So there wasn't an intellectual problem at all. The issue was that the Soviet Union could never build an industry that functioned efficiently. And there were two reasons for that. One was that there wasn't a consumer market to push capital into firms, but also to determine which firms were producing the most efficiently. And that lack of a consumer market was a major hindrance. But second, the Soviet Union was always focused on catching up to the cutting edge, which seems like a sensible strategy, but it kept the Soviet Union in the position of trying to replicate and to copy rather than to innovate and to push the frontier. And so from the late 1950s all the way to the end of the Soviet Union, there was a focus on replication rather than on innovation, which set the Soviets back, because although they were pretty good at replication, in an industry dominated by Moore's law, if you replicate, you condemn yourself not being just a little bit behind, but far behind, because even if you're a couple generations behind, Moore's law means that you're several exponential growth cycles behind. And so it was a bad strategy for competition with massive consequences for the economy, but also for the distribution of military power on the world stage.
Yeah, so that answered the question, why did the Soviet Union become unsuccessful in the chip industry? I think when I was reading your book, I had a few notes, and then they almost became the golden soundbite, as they say. So one of which is, science doesn't give you the automatically give you the technology or the industry, right? Just having the science alone doesn't guarantee you're an industry leader. And the second one relevant to this is that, well, I comment on the second one later. I think, you have another story that's a better fit for that. But so you obviously went beyond Soviet Union, and then you went on and compare a few other countries. In the US, obviously, is very much a top player, and then it's very significant. And I learned from your book the interesting fact of the very first order for chips was actually made by the Apollo aircraft. So would you share a little bit about how the US military funding had initially helped getting things started, and then some US entrepreneurs pivoted to the commercial markets, right? And how important and or critical was the pivot?
Yeah, it's a great question, because you can find lots of histories written by people who are driven by their ideological priors that say, well, either A, government is great at funding innovation, or B, only the private sector can do it. And the reality was it was a really interesting and complicated mix of public sector funding and private sector efforts to find market opportunities. So in the 1950s, the Pentagon was fixated on ways to miniaturize computing power, to put more computing capabilities in planes and in military systems, in munitions themselves, but also in spacecraft. And so there's a lot of government money going into the question of how to miniaturize computing power, and in transistors, which were seen to be an important facet of miniaturization. And in addition to shrinking, there's also the goal of reducing power consumption. And so the Pentagon was willing to pay far more than anyone else to get miniaturized computing capabilities. And so it funded a whole generation of PhD students. It poured money into a variety of tech firms, both kind of legacy tech firms, large tech firms at the time, and also small startups like Texas Instruments or Fairchild Semiconductor. And so the first two integrated circuits were simultaneously invented, one by Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments and one by Bob Noyce at Fairchild. And both of those companies relied very heavily on government contracts, but the specific research that was done by both Noyce and Kilby was done on their own. It wasn't in response to a government contract. And both of those companies realized after they made the first integrated circuit that although this would be an important product for the government, it would even be more important if you could sell it to the vast commercial market. And so from the earliest stages, people like Bob Noyce at Fairchild were thinking, how do I take advantage of the government contract to give me my first couple years of revenue, but then use that space to turn this into a mass market product, drive down costs, make it reliable, and put it in new types of devices. And so Noyce was very, very deliberate at saying he wanted to attract government funding in general. He wanted to win government contracts, but he didn't want the government dictating his R&D agenda. As he told one interview at the time, venturing is about venturing. You want to take the risk, and he didn't want the government dictating his R&D. He didn't want them dictating his business model. So it was a really interesting mix of government funding plus entrepreneurs who weren't focused on government funding, but instead were focused on how do you sell this to the mass market.
Yeah, that's so interesting. We'll come back to the entrepreneurial spirit in a few minutes. But then, you talk about Japan. So Japan made a major push in the 80s, and they seem to be on their way to dominate the market. And then they stopped. So what happened there?
So the Japanese chip makers that grew rapidly in the 1980s were focused on a type of chip called a DRAM memory chip. And DRAM chips at the time were largely interchangeable between companies. So it's hard to differentiate your product from another rivals. The only ways to do it were A, who got to the next generation first. So if you got to the next generation 6 months before your rivals, that was a good thing. And then B, what your defect rate was in manufacturing. So if you had 1% defect rate and your rival had 2%, your chips were better. But that's not great differentiation. And so margins were very, very thin. It was a very competitive market. But at the time, Japanese banks were very willing to lend vast sums at close to zero interest rates to Japanese chip makers. And so CEOs of Japanese chip makers focused almost exclusively on market share. They wanted to win market share without regard to profit, which was a sort of rational approach if you had free capital from banks. You could expand for a long time and hope that eventually you'd find some pathway to profitability at the end. And that had the effect of driving down DRAM prices, driving down profitability across the industry, and putting a lot of pressure on US DRAM firms, and actually drove most of the US DRAM firms, companies like Intel, which was founded to make DRAM chips, come out of that specific market. But it wasn't a great long run strategy though, because it required a ton of capital investment, but the return on capital was really low because it was highly competitive. And so the Japanese chip makers that gained extraordinary market share ended up not making much money at all. And they found that they were very vulnerable towards the end of the 1980s when Korean producers like Samsung and SK Hynix entered the market. There were no competitive moats around the DRAM producers. So Samsung just drove them all out by having a slightly lower cost structure. And so today, Japan is a relatively small scale chip maker, despite being the world's largest chip maker around 1990, because its DRAM firms almost all went bankrupt or were bought out by rivals. And so today, Japan is not a critical player when it comes to manufacturing chips, although it still remains an important player in other parts of the supply chain.
Yeah, in that period, you mentioned there are also some entrepreneurs trying to be really innovative and then pivoting the industry to a slightly different direction. Maybe that has to do with the Japan's setback.
That's right. Yeah, and there's two companies that I think that illustrated an alternative pathway to the sort of market share focus of major Japanese chip makers at the time. One was a Japanese firm, one an American firm. But the Japanese firm that succeeded the best was Sony, which never competed in the mass market DRAM chips, and instead was focused on using semiconductor technology to build consumer products like the Sony Walkman. At the time, it was a revolutionary consumer product, the iPod of its day, so to speak. And Sony was able to build a very profitable business at the time because it had products with competitive moats. Everyone knew what Sony was. The brand was trusted, whereas no one could really remember what differentiated one Toshiba DRAM chip from an NEC DRAM. There was no differentiation. So Sony was a firm that operated very differently from the norm in the Japanese chip industry and did much better as a result. The other pathway was Intel, which was a US firm that had started, as I mentioned, in this commodity DRAM market, but left the market in the mid 1980s because profit margins were so low, and instead decided to bet everything on a new type of chip called a microprocessor, and struck a deal with IBM to put its microprocessor in the first PC alongside an operating system written up by a young guy named Bill Gates. And it proved to be an extraordinary bet because Microsoft software was designed to work well with Intel chips. And so those two companies, up to the present day, dominate the software and the hardware for PCs. And Intel grew to be the world's largest chip maker by the 2000s, based on its dominance of the PC market. And it was a market that always had much less competition than DRAM because Intel had intellectual property that it could use to defend its market position, and because it was a more complex product at the time that was harder for new entrants to try to replicate. And so Intel was far more successful than the Japanese DRAM producers that looked likely to put it out of business in the 1980s.
Yeah, so one other soundbite I got out of your book and your talks was that innovation trumps everything else, right? Industry policy, capital leverage or trade strategies. So all these things are secondary to innovation to make some countries' industry, come up on top. So that's one. And the other one is relevant to this is, is really a bad strategy to rely on copying and spying even, right? In the galloping industry, industry moving fast. So I thought these are very interesting and very insightful. So then you also talk about, the industry was born to be international, not necessarily global, right? So, related to that, I found the TSMC story so fascinating, and they become so critical to the global economy today. And would you tell us a bit about who Morris Chang is and how he built TSMC?
Well, I think Morris Chang is arguably the most underestimated business person of the last century. He's someone whose product every one of us relies on every single day. even though we never see them and have never bought one of them directly. He was born in China before World War II, spent his childhood fleeing the Japanese armies, moving to Hong Kong, then to Chongqing. And after the war ended, he and his family moved to Shanghai, where his father was a government official and also worked as a banker. After the communists took power in '49, he fled again to Hong Kong before winning admission to Harvard, where he enrolled in 1950 and was the only Chinese student in his class. Sort of an extraordinary data point on
What
how
was he
different that.
studying? What was he
So,
studying?
so he started studying English literature. He loved Shakespeare to this day, but one of his uncles told him to study something useful, and so and so after his freshman year, he transferred to MIT and started studying engineering and physics. And he finished his undergraduate degree at MIT. And then after that, he got a job at an electronics firm called Sylvania right outside of Boston before moving to Texas Instruments to manufacture transistors for TI. And he spent 3 decades at TI building up their semiconductor business. And in the 1980s, he was almost he was one of the figures that was best placed to succeed the CEO, but he was passed over for the CEO job and left the company in the middle of the 1980s and was looking for something new to do. And while he was looking for something new to do, he was approached by a couple of officials from the Taiwanese government. And Cheng had never his connection to Taiwan was through Texas Instruments. He didn't have family there, but he'd opened a Texas Instrument facility in 1969 on Taiwan, and in the process had gotten to know a number of the key economic policymaking officials in Taiwan, like KT Lee, for example, who was a really influential economic policymaking bureaucrat, the finance minister. And they approached Morris Chang and said, "Would you like to build a semiconductor industry in Taiwan?" And he said yes. And so he founded TSMC in 1987 around a new business model, which is important to understand. Before this point, almost all chips were designed and manufactured by the same companies. But Chang realized that manufacturing is getting more complicated, more capital intensive, and that if he could focus solely on manufacturing, he could do it better than his rivals. And he could offer services to chip designers that would allow them to avoid the capital investment needed to build their own factories. This proved an extraordinarily successful model. And so today, TSMC is the world's largest chip maker and also has the world's most advanced manufacturing technology for processor chips as a result.
Yeah, so it's a super interesting story. And for those in the audience, Morris Chen, the Chinese name is Zhang Zhongmo. And then, so TSMC is Taiji Dian, right? And also, from the stories, this story and the previous ones, one can see clearly that, the government always had a role in the semiconductor industry. And, it's an interesting balance the government has to play, right? So you don't want to overstep it. You don't want to leave it, too hands off. So there are a lot of good insights in the book about that as well. So my next question is really another key player in the industry. So the ASML, right? So my question is, why is EUV? So again, for the audience, EUV stands for extreme ultraviolet. EUV lithography is 超紫外光刻机、极紫外光刻机. So why is EUV lithography so critical in producing cutting-edge chips? And why is it so difficult for others to replicate their success at ASML?
So one of the key process steps in making semiconductors is to shine light at a silicon wafer via a mask that has a pattern in it, and that creates a pattern on the wafer. That's a very simple way of describing it. It's much more complex because the light that you need to shine to fashion transistors that are nanometer in scale must be very fine. So visible light is several hundred nanometers in wavelength, and that's far too broad in terms of its ability to carve tiny indentations on silicon. So now we use EUV light, which is 13.5 nanometers of wavelength, to do the patterning on silicon wafers. And so to produce this type of light is very, very difficult. What ASML does to produce this light is they have they have balls of tin, 30 microns in diameter, falling through a vacuum. The micron is a millionth of a meter. They pulverize the tin with 2 shots from one of the most powerful lasers ever deployed in a commercial device. The tin explodes into a plasma, measuring around 40 times hotter than the surface of the sun inside of this machine. The plasma emits light at just the right wavelength, 13.5 nanometers. It's collected by several of the flattest mirrors humans have ever made. And these mirrors direct the light to the silicon wafer, and it begins the process of patterning transistors into the wafer. So this machine, an EUV lithography machine, costs over $150 million to buy. They take multiple 747s to transport. They have hundreds of thousands of components inside, and so they're the most expensive and complex machine tools humans have ever made. And they're produced by just one company, ASML, in the Netherlands, which itself buys some of the key components like the laser, the chamber in which the several 100,000-degree explosion is happening, the optical systems are themselves bought by individual companies that have unique capabilities. So there's a whole supply chain that is built up on companies with just one or two components with one or two companies that know how to supply them. And in the machine itself, which has several 100,000 components, the key challenge is getting it to work regularly. Because if you think of a machine in which every component broke down once a year, if you have 1 million components in your machine will never work. So you need a mean time to failure of years for the average component. And so the key skill of ASML, the company that makes these machines, is its ability to engineer them such that they're able to buy components from key suppliers and put them together in a way that produces the precision and the reliability such that they can be used for mass manufacturing. And that's something that ASML has spent the last 3 decades developing.
It's amazing. Hundreds of thousands of pieces, components, subcomponents would be needed to make one key component. And also they were made by all different manufacturers from a few countries. That itself is a huge piece of engineering work to make it work. So it's amazing. How expensive are these machines?
So for ASML has spent billions of dollars over the last several decades building up the R&D capabilities and then the manufacturing capacity to produce them. If you want to buy one today, it costs around $150 million.
Wow. And how many machines are they making per year, roughly?
They make several dozen per year. They're trying to ramp up capacity right now because there's demand for the types of chips that only these machines can produce. But the number of customers they have is very small. It's just a couple of companies that make cutting edge logic chips, a couple of companies make cutting edge memory chips. So they know their market size is pretty easily knowable because there's just 7 or 8 customers that could plausibly buy UV machines in the world.
Yeah, so it's super impressive on that. So not only is it the machines are so difficult to make, so complex, but they're big, right? You mentioned a couple of 747s to carry them, and they're expensive, and only have a couple key customers. But yet, it's very hard to replace them. I guess just because the technology barriers and also the hugely capital expensive, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so that's the another key player in the industry. And then so one other thing I really enjoyed about reading your book is that you had not only made the technologies so easy to understand, but also brought some characters to life, right? So William Shockley, Robert Noyce, Andy Grove, and Morris Chang, of course, to mention just a few. But one thing they all have in common is that they all share very deep technical backgrounds, right? A few of them were even first-generation immigrants. So they're strong in certain areas, but relatively inexperienced in others. Did they have to go through some transition periods before they became successful entrepreneurs? And this question may be particularly relevant to this audience.
I think what stood out to me about many of the most successful people in the history of the industry is that they were able to combine technical expertise that was second to none, with an ability to envision future markets that didn't yet exist. So people like Morris Chang, like Morris Chang's a great example. Morris Chang convinced the Taiwanese government to help him fund a business to serve a market that didn't exist. He envisioned that there would be companies that would only design chips and would turn to him for manufacturing services, but there was no such market when he started building. And yet he was able to see into the future and imagine that if he built the facility, people would want to buy it. Similarly, if you look at Bob Noyce and Fairchild, he knew there was a market for very expensive, low volume chips for military systems, but he bet that there would be a market for much less expensive, more standardized, high volume chips for civilian computer systems. Didn't exist when he started, but he envisioned it there. And so I think there's something to be learned from the ability to combine technical expertise and the ability to understand the engineering behind a product at a very granular level with the connection to future markets and the ability to not only see what the market looks like today, but what it could look like tomorrow if you applied this technology in new ways. And I think if you think of the generations of products that have been invented because of semiconductors, first mainframe computers, then pocket calculators, then Sony Walkman, then iPods, all of these steps required envisioning entirely new categories of products. And I think the most impressive entrepreneurs were those that combined their technical expertise and used it to envision technologies the rest of us would never even thought were possible or interesting or marketable.
Yeah. So this is where Steve Jobs would say, look, consumers don't know what they want until they see
That's
it.
right. That's
So
right.
that's entirely different marketing approach. So they are visionaries, but did they have to overcome some maybe business acumen issues or experience issues in order to get a company?
Yeah, I think it depends on who you're looking at. Certain people like Morris Chang, I think, had an excellent sense of business acumen as well. And under his leadership, he has succeeded very well financially, as well as technologically. Others like Bob Noyce, for example, was not really managerially inclined. He loved thinking about new products. He loved thinking about technology, but in reality, he left the day-to-day management to others, to Gordon Moore and to Andy Grove at Intel. And I think the lesson there is that it's for entrepreneurs, it's not necessarily the case that the same people who are good at envisioning markets are good at management and good at managing finances. And Noyce did well because he recognized that he wasn't good at management. He recognized that he wasn't interested in the day-to-day. He recognized that although people found him enormously charismatic, everyone also realized that he wasn't the person to turn to when a specific problem needed to be solved. You turned to Andy Grove instead. And so Bob Noyce actually stepped back from an active management role at Intel only just a decade after founding it. He remained involved in sort of a loose capacity, but he was always more interested in the vision for the future rather than in the execution of a business model.
Yeah. So as a venture investor, we always really appreciate the people who know their strength and weakness, especially the weakness. So great for Robert Noyce to recognize his shortcomings. But in some other cases, William Shockley came to mind, right? He didn't realize that. So even though he's great scientist, Nobel laureate, but the business really didn't take off. So maybe you can tell us about that and the genesis of Fairfield.
Sure, yeah. So Shockley won the Nobel Prize for inventing the transistor. And by all accounts, he was a brilliant theoretical physicist. In the actual invention of the transistor, two of his colleagues did the experimental work to prove that the transistor worked, but it was Shockley who theorized all of it. He famously actually spent Christmas 1947 locked up for 2 weeks in a hotel room thinking about trying to understand the physics of the transistor. And then he had an aha moment where he wrote it all out on a piece of paper and unlocked the mystery of how transistors work. So from a theoretical perspective, he had really unique capabilities. But when it came to business and management and personnel management, everyone thought he was highly obnoxious. And so he hired some of the most brilliant minds in the industry. Bob Noyce, Gordon Moore were all people hired by him. But they immediately found the atmosphere he created toxic. He was the person that inspired everyone around him to dislike him. And so as quickly as they were hired, they began to plan their exit. And eight of the top engineers at Shockley's lab, including Noyce and Gordon Moore, very quickly banded together, set off, and started up their own firm, which became Fairchild and led to the invention of the first integrated circuit.
Yeah, so it's just there are a lot of fascinating stories in the book about the industry, about the key players that help build the industry. So William Shockley's story is not a proof of what you concluded, that science alone doesn't give you the technology nor the industry. And you also mentioned, there were William Shockley actually had two students from Soviet Union, right? So again, he didn't do it, and then his students also failed to make the industry take off.
That's right.
Yeah, so super interesting. And then now, perhaps one other thing you dedicated quite some space for is the geopolitical part. And particularly, recently the hot spot is U.S.-China. So China has made some substantial effort, right, trying to establish itself in the industry. And would you tell us what's their current state? And also, what might be the recent impact of the export restrictions on China, initially by US, and then recently joined by Japan and the Netherlands?
Yeah, so I think to start, what's the position of China in the chip industry? China is the world's largest purchaser of semiconductors. It spends more money each year importing chips as it spends importing oil. So the flow of chips into China is one of the most significant flows in the entire international trading system. And these chips are imported in large part because they're impossible to produce domestically. They're produced in Taiwan or South Korea or in Japan. And so since around 2014, the Chinese government has been trying via a series of industrial policy programs to bolster its domestic chip industry, to raise the technology level and to build out capacity to make more advanced chips domestically. And this has had some successes and some failures. The successes have been in terms of building out capacity at the low end, so low end logic chips. Capacity in China is growing very rapidly. There have been a number of chip design companies that have developed very capable chip designs. So for example, Huawei's smartphone application processor designer was, by all accounts, a very successful designer before the US put Huawei on the entity list in 2020. Other companies like BREN, the GPU designer, by all accounts, has very capable GPU designs. So in chip design, Chinese firms have done relatively well from a technological perspective, less well from a business perspective, but from a technical perspective, there's been some successes. And then in terms of fabrication of chips, there have been some successes and some failures. The success story is YMTC, which is a producer of memory chips, which until recently looked likely to be a new entrant into one of the key markets for memory chips. It advanced very rapidly technologically. It was about to win Apple as a customer for producing chips for iPhones. And so until recently, with the recent US controls, YMTC was a real success story. But next to that, there were also a fair number of failures. There were a number of instances of outright frauds in the Chinese chip industry where fraudsters said they were building a chip company, got lots of loans or grants from local government, and ended up not doing anything of the sort. And so I think on the whole, the success of industrial policy efforts in China since 2014 are pretty mixed, I would say. Some successes, some failures, and a lot of the successes are less commercial successes than sort of technological success. They proved that Chinese firms could match the cutting edge or close to the cutting edge technologically, but they weren't actually commercially viable in many cases. So today, China is a big producer of chips, but chip making in China relies on importing lots of machine tools, chemicals, software from Japan, the US, Europe, and elsewhere. And China's chip making capacity is still focused mostly on older low-tech chips. So when it comes to cutting edge chips, China imports from Taiwan, South Korea, the US. and others. And so the geopolitical dynamic has been becoming more important in the last decade or so, especially the last 5 years, as the United States and Japan in particular have worried about the extent to which Chinese firms are gaining advantages in computing power or advances in computing power that could be deployed to intelligence and to military systems. And one of the things you find historically, as our discussion illustrated, is that there's a really deep relationship between computing and intelligence capabilities and military capabilities. And this has been the case since the first chips were invented for use in guidance systems. And so for most of the last 3 decades, the chip industry didn't really have to think about politics or geopolitics or military systems because companies were focused on selling chips for smartphones or for PCs, and governments didn't really get involved. But as the US and as Japan equally have gotten worried about their military positions in East Asia, worried about growing Chinese capabilities and their inability to keep the gap between their capabilities and China's capabilities, they've been focusing more on whether they can maintain a technological edge over the Chinese military. And increasingly, when you start thinking about next generation military systems, you're thinking about applying autonomy and artificial intelligence to military systems. And that requires advanced semiconductors, both to, for example, if you envision an advanced drone, for example, flying semi-autonomously, you need both a lot of chips on the drone itself, but even more importantly than that, you need chips in the data center that's going to train the drone to fly autonomously. And so about 5 years ago, US officials began realizing that most of the world's advanced chips that were used to produce AI systems were built in Taiwan, largely designed by US firms, but made in Taiwan. They were made with machine tools from the US, Japan, and the Netherlands, which had an oligopolistic position in the machine tool business. And we're worried that the existing set of controls that were in place allowed Chinese firms to buy GPU chips that you use in data centers and deploy them to potential military uses. So there's been a number of media reports on this having happened. And so over the last couple of years, but especially last year, the US government tightened controls in a pretty dramatic new way. In the past, the rule was you can't sell US chips to Chinese military users, but now the new rule is you can't transfer these chips into China at all. So advanced GPUs for training AI systems are now illegal to transfer into China. And this is intended to slow down China's ability to roll out advanced data centers and thereby slow down the ability to train more advanced AI systems.
So in the past, this is an audience question. So Jake Sullivan, made some statement that U.S. wanted to stay 2 generations ahead. Are there any changes recently on that position?
Yeah, so that's right. The traditional U.S. policy was to try to keep 2 generations ahead of rivals. And it's interesting actually. Like Taiwan is a generation ahead of the U.S., so that policy hasn't worked out very well. But there has been a change that Jake Sullivan, who's the national security advisor, announced last year to not only keep the gap, but to grow the gap in capabilities between the U.S. and its friends and allies and China. And the rationale for this is, if you talk to people in the Pentagon, what they'll say is, we used to be absolutely certain 20 years ago, if there were a worst case scenario in the Taiwan Straits, we knew what the outcome would be. Today, that's not certain. No one knows what the outcome would be. It's a very uncertain situation. And as the Pentagon looks at the growth in China's quantitative capabilities, so more ships, more planes, more missiles, it becomes more important for the US to match China's quantitative advantage with qualitative advantages in military systems, because the US is not going to be able to match the expansion of the PLA missile for missile or ship for ship. And so as the US has bet more heavily on maintaining and growing its qualitative advantage, having a similar advantage in the computing components that are going to shape the next generation military systems has been seen by the Pentagon to be more important than almost ever before. And so that's what's sparked Sullivan's description of the policy change. It's that compared to 10 years ago, the US is even more reliant on qualitative differentials for its military position.
Right. So the next question comes from audience, several questions, roughly asking the same question. So basically, it is, given the export restriction, what are the likely response from China? And also, is it even possible to imagine a independently developed ecosystem, doing the same advanced chips?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly possible to imagine an independently developed ecosystem. I think the question is how likely is it and over what time horizon? And there's uncertainty, right? I can't give a super confident answer. I think my sense is looking at the structure of the industry today and the extent to which China's a fairly small player in a lot of key nodes of the supply chain, is that it will be quite difficult for an independent industry to be built up. It certainly can be done, but it's going to take a fair amount of time, I think. Whether it's the software tools, which are dominated by 3 US companies, the machine tools, where there's basically 5 companies that play the most important role, all of them outside of China. There's just a lot of different parts of the supply chain that are currently outside of China and will need to be domesticated over time. Is it possible? Yes. Is it likely to happen over 5 years? I think that's probably unlikely. And I think the reason is that the question isn't, can China or any country catch up to the cutting edge, the 2023 cutting edge in 5 or 10 years time? The question is, can you catch up to the 2033 cutting edge by 2033? And if you assume that Moore's law is going to roughly continue, or maybe slow down a bit, but it's going to keep going, then you've got exponential growth assumed every 2 years. And so catching up is just really hard to do. And I'm struck by the fact that the trend of the last 10 years is not of catching up, but of falling behind. Everyone's fallen behind TSMC. Everyone's fallen behind ASML. The US fell behind TSMC, Intel fell behind. Europe, Japan are far behind. And so the trend isn't catch up. And so that's why I think if China wants to pursue a path of developing an independent supply chain, it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard and time consuming to do.
Yeah. So I think the next question, maybe we'll make it the last question from the audience, is that related to TSMC in Taiwan. If there were some military intervention disruption, how likely is TSMC be able to continue their production?
So I think it's highly unlikely that you have ongoing production for a couple of reasons. I think, first off, if there was some sort of blockade or a war, you'd lose access to the inputs that TSMC needs to produce. So chemicals, silicon wafers. There's all sorts of inputs, some of which are produced in Taiwan, but a lot of which are imported from Japan, from Europe, from elsewhere. Second, the machine tools inside of TSMC facilities, like all semiconductor facilities, are not produced by TSMC. They're produced by ASML, produced by Applied Materials. And so you generally require those companies to service your machines, to provide software updates to your machines. So ASML has staff on site with all EUV lithography machines for the lifetime of those machines. And so the ability to operate those machines without, for example, ASML personnel on site is questionable. Maybe you could do it, but it's far from guaranteed. Third, you need the staff members of TSMC to be there and keep working. And that seems very questionable that all of them would be there in the chance of a war. And then you need to make sure that no one deliberately blew up the facilities. And I think you could imagine multiple parties that would have an incentive to do that in case of a war. So I really think it's close to a 0% likelihood that that the facilities could keep operating amid or after a war, which is why the economic cost of the whole world is dramatic, because the whole world relies on TSMC. And in case of a disruption, we're talking about Great Depression levels of disruption to global manufacturing output.
Yeah, so from their strategic planning point of view, is expanding their footprint to some other locations a viable option? And how soon can that be meaningful, right? Meaningful hedge?
Yeah, so they are expanding right now. They're building a facility in Japan, probably a second one as well. They're building a campus in Arizona, probably a new facility in Germany at some point as well. But the amount of capacity TSMC is currently moving abroad is fairly small still. And all of the leading edge capabilities are going to be kept in Taiwan. So the leading edge processes for GPUs, for Apple's application processor for smartphones, these are all going to be still made in Taiwan, and the R&D for them will be done in Taiwan. So there is diversification underway, but it's slow because TSMC will say, and I think accurately, that they're most efficient when all of their production is basically right next to each other in a couple of cities in Taiwan. It's a short train ride between all their facilities. Workers can go back and forth between facilities for the afternoon. And so TSMC argues that that's the most efficient way to produce the most advanced chips. And that might be true. And I think there's a balancing act to be struck between the reality that the current semiconductor supply chain is very efficient, and it's provided in extraordinary technological advances. And so we don't want to disrupt that. And so there's a balancing act between maintaining that efficiency and also the political desire to have more geographic diversification. And that's the source of debate right now in governments in Taiwan and Japan and the US and elsewhere. It's how to strike the right balance between efficiency and the desire for diversification.
Well, it's been absolutely fascinating and as well as enlightening, Chris. For the audience, if you're interested in technology, entrepreneurship, or trying to understand how geopolitical competition may shape you and your careers, this book is a must-read. I myself have learned so much of the book, which again, the title, Chip War, the fight for the world's most critical technology. Lastly, I want to invite the audience to unmute their microphones. And maybe, well, if I can, I don't unmute, ask to unmute. Yeah, so if you can unmute, click on the button, and then please join me to thanking Chris for his great book and spending time with us today. Well, thank you, Chris.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Wade, as well.
Thank you.
Great hosting. Great session. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.